Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Story, where we discuss what Canada is, what Canada could be, and what Canada should be. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Canadian Story. I'm here with my co-host, Zach Gerber, and my good friend, Cody. Cody, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Happy to be on here. It's it's been about a year and a bit of you guys doing this, so I'm a little sad you're only finally asking me to do it now.
Nice. So for those who don't know, Cody is an old colleague of mine. He currently runs the Energy Network out of the Modern Miracle Network, which is a advocacy group for Canadian oil and gas and changing the narrative that has been pushed by basically radical environmentalists claiming that Canadian oil is dirty, whereas it's actually the cleanest in the world. And it is the only oil in the world that is being produced by a truly free and democratic society that I'm aware of. I think. Well, I mean, America, obviously.
America would have oil. Yeah.
America's oil too. Sorry. I take it back. It's one of the only democratic jurisdictions producing oil. Yeah. So, Cody, welcome to the show. Share a little bit about yourself before we get into your work. Who are you? What makes you tick? Why do you love the things you love?
Yeah. Okay. Well, God, what makes me tick? I guess I developed a passion for politics when I was very young, and global affairs and all that. I was that weird kid that would stay up all night long looking at random Wikipedia articles. So take what you will about me. But I really kind of came into it in university. I got involved with some union politics, and that kind of got me hooked. I was doing some government relations, and then I kind of fell in love with the idea about how to kind of improve society for the better, and found myself doing some pro-energy advocacy, trying to ensure that Canadians are recognized for not just being harbingers of peace like we were in the 90s, but also being global energy suppliers in the 21st century.
So you're an Albertan. You grew up here. Talk a little bit about that. Maybe even you could share a little bit about your time on the Brian Jean campaign in the last election, and kind of what you've learned about politics and what you've learned about Alberta being such an integral part of the Alberta, let's call it, intellectual ecosystem, which a large part of is the defense of our primary industry.
Yeah. So I'm born and raised Albertan. Grew up kind of in the primary oil sands region in Cold Lake. Parents were in the Air Force, so a real base brat, and have been from one end of the province to the other. Went to university in Lethbridge, so I've seen how they do it in southern Alberta. Currently living in downtown Calgary, and kind of been all over. Especially as you mentioned, working on Brian Jean's previous leadership campaign, which was, it was a very eye-opening experience to politics and to how things work internally with the party. Before that, I'd never really been involved in provincial politics in the party, caucus format of things. And it really opened my eyes to how Albertans really work, how we really kind of think about politics. We're very, I would say, this is my opinion, we're very risk-averse to outside influence on what we do. We really don't like being told what to do. Maybe a bit of that Wild West mentality that we still kind of have. And it also opened my eyes that you can't just put one ideal and slap it all over every Albertan. We all have our own things that make us truck along, our own quirks and personalities, and we all might agree on one thing, but another thing might just be, tribalism to the max, shards of glass flying everywhere. I find it very unique like that. Another thing, and especially with this current leadership and, future premiership, it's very important that these candidates were, for the last 4 months, hitting the pavement and actually talking with Albertans. So there's a little bit more on the line now that the new leader of the UCP party is going to be premier. it's very different than rallying your party. You now have to be there for people who may not have the exact same views as you. So, which for some people could be hard, for some people could be easy, and it'll be interesting to see how that kind of shakes out the next little while.
So when we were working together, and for those who don't know, Cody and I were colleagues for a number of months back in kind of 2019, 2020, or 2019. You lived on a farm and you were engaging in the very rural lifestyle, and you love it, and you love the rodeo lifestyle, and you're a rural Albertan. You love rural Alberta. Why don't you share a little bit about that? Like what makes you tick in that way?
Yeah, I think it kind of just goes back to the idea, I find being on the farm really freeing and rewarding. You also learn a lot about life. I mean, unfortunately, death is a very real part of our lives, and that's something you unfortunately have to deal with from time to time on the farm. Animals die, they get sick, whatever, and it reinforces the idea that there's no permanence, but there's also beauty in living life kind of how you want to live it. Also, I also did a little bit of rodeo. I had about a 10-second bronc riding career and a little bit of a longer wild cow milking career, which that was a little bit, that was an interesting moment in life. But it really kind of helped me connect to my roots and made me feel really at home being out in the country. I don't know if that's just because I grew up in a small rural town, but there's definitely a disconnect between the way people here downtown Calgary think versus a lot of the people I grew up with. There's a lot more, I would guess, say a lot more independence, a lot more, I'm not going to call AMA to, switch out my busted tire on the road. I'm just going to do it myself kind of thing. Like you grow up a little bit different out there. You tend to rely on yourself more than you would inside.
I like that self-reliance. And you talked about that when we were working together a fair bit, how that they're that Alberta mentality of, just get it done. And you have your own podcast that you were doing with some friends about that kind of lifestyle. Do you want to share a little bit about why you started that and what it meant to you to be able to talk to your friends about the lifestyle that you love?
Yeah, we had a podcast, I guess years ago now. We kind of stopped, but it was called Young Ranch, and it was, I guess, the idea about it was to kind of bring the idea of rural, farm, out in the boonies kind of lifestyle together and bring in kind of a cohesive element of the aura of being, a young person in kind of those different occupations. I mean, both my buddies that did it, they were, farmers and heavy duty mechanics, which provides some colorful commentary on some of the social things, where I come from more of I guess a whiter collar background of education and a bit more political. So it's there's often sometimes loggerheads of terminology and kind of issues, but it helps provide a more fulsome conversation. And we really didn't see much of an outlet for younger Canadians kind of in that lifestyle. So that was kind of the basics of it. Unfortunately, we just all got busy with life and couldn't continue on with it in the capacity that we wanted to. But it was definitely a great experience being able to talk shop, have a drink, pop a beer, and kind of just decompress. Almost like if you were sitting in a shop after we're moving cows all day, kind of the BSing, if you will, that takes hold afterwards about the day. So.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to talk about is we haven't had a lot of people from Lethbridge area. We've had a couple on, but you went to university there. Share a little bit about what the ethos of Lethbridge is and what that experience was like going to school down there. And like you said, you have a bit of a feel of the southern Alberta as well as Cold Lake, for those who don't know, which is far north, basically. It's north of Edmonton. It's not quite as far as Lacrete, but what's southern Alberta like as opposed to northern Alberta? What's the difference?
Wow, I would say, and it's weird, and I'm not sure what exactly the influence is on it. Maybe it's, I find Southern Alberta a lot more religious in the fact that, there's very, what's the best way to term this? It's very concentrated in, 2-3 separate religions down there, and they kind of find their own tribes. They all go to the same churches, the same, community events, and that's great. But it's a little bit different than Northern Alberta, where I find you still have that religious element. But I think maybe since it is a bit more rural up north than down south, it's still a little bit scattered. And it was interesting because Lethbridge was a great place to go for university if you're a student and young, and you're going to the college to learn or the university to learn. But when I graduated, I didn't find there was as much opportunity down there as there was for someone who, say, graduated from Mount Royal or U of C. And I'm sure that's changed around now because it's been quite a while, but it's still very, very centered on maybe someone who went to a trade school or is more into that agricultural thing or whatever. It's very more blue collar down south and up north than the middle regions, which kind of provides a bit more of a interesting demographic, especially in terms of politics.
Yes. I mean, they're a very freedom-loving people down south.
Yeah, they also don't like to be messed with, and maybe that's
they don't like to be told what to do. I liked what you said earlier. I want you to expound on it a bit. But what do you think it is about Albertans that they don't like being told what to do? Because I've often said on this podcast and in other avenues, I didn't take the vaccine because I don't like being told what to do primarily. Mm-hmm. And I certainly don't believe that government should have the right to tell me what to do with my own body. And that seems to be on a broader scale, an Albertan sentiment. Now, it's not just an Albertan sentiment. The Scots are similar. And I would say the Afghanistani people are very similar. There's this thing in certain cultures where they just buck against the idea of being told what to do. What do you think that is?
I think a lot of that is, there wasn't anything out here 120 years ago. And when kind of the first wave of homesteaders came out, they had to rely on themselves. They had to build sod houses. Like, pretty sure my great grandparents lived in a mud hut for the first little while while they were in Saskatchewan when they came over. There was very little out here, and you just had to get by. Whereas, and I think that's a little bit of the regionalism as well. I mean, Eastern Canada was a lot more built up. It had been, developing since, middle 1600s. So there was a little bit more of a progenesis of, I guess, we'll call it more developed civilization in terms of, cities and towns and resources. And that kind of carried on. We've up until the 50s, there weren't any major highways really that connected any of Alberta. You were still, driving trucks on gravel roads or, riding your horse into town in some cases. And it's just a very different idea of growing up and living. I think it carried down through generations as well. And obviously politics has a lot to say in it, especially, I think Albertans felt sort of disenfranchised in the 70s, the National Energy Program and all that stuff. They felt like their way of life and what was, driving their economies and a lot of their jobs. And in some cases, they felt like it was being roped from the East, and they didn't feel like they were getting a fair share is a sentiment that I think a lot of Albertans felt then. And I think that those wounds haven't really been healed. I think they were kind of assuaged a bit more in the 90s and early 2000s under maybe Ralph Klein and maybe a little bit earlier. But I think those fractures were left to fester, and I don't think politics on either side of the aisle was able to really mend them. it both conceptually and
that's a very good analysis. So you're for those listeners who don't know, you run the Canada Energy Network, which is a advocacy group for Canadian energy. Do you want to share a little bit about what that work is and why you're so passionate about it?
Yeah, so the Canadian Energy News Network kind of came out of the idea of there needed to be an alternative voice, and now there's many alternative voices. But for the longest time, we were just being bombarded with all these, call them facts, but loosely based. Everyone knows like in 2010, if someone said Alberta had the dirtiest oil, you probably wouldn't have blinked an eye because that's just what you've been told for forever. But the truth is, industry's been working on drawing emissions down for years. I mean, it's Rome wasn't built in a day, and I know that's kind of an overused analogy, but environmentalists were really good at sounding the alarm of what we needed to do to reduce emissions, reduce environmental impacts. But there comes a point when you have to acknowledge that, okay, now industries kind of listen and they're starting to do that. And are these timelines we're putting down actually going to help the situation, or is it just going to make things worse off? So the idea of, the Energy News Network is to highlight those facts, like, reducing emissions intensity per barrel by 32%. That's pretty damn good in my books. And hopefully in 10 years, it'll be, 60%. As long as there's a continuum of progress in fixing those challenges, I don't think it's quite fair to keep targeting the industry in that way. Obviously, you need to be critical of things, and don't get me wrong, like in every community, in every industry and sector, there's always going to be a bad actor. But you shouldn't let the bad actor detract from the actual good that different groups are doing in terms of, energy, right? So that was kind of the idea. So we put out a daily email with different energy facts, kind of highlighting, some things in the news or whatnot that might not necessarily be true, just to provide Albertans with, a balanced conversation, or not Albertans, Canadians with a balanced conversation about energy. So.
Okay, so let's do that then. So you must be equipped with some facts that might bust popular myths in the mainstream media about Canadian oil. What are rifle off some points that that you hear blasted toward Canadians that just aren't simply true?
One of the big ones, especially right now, and you're seeing it, especially in Europe with talks of windfall taxes, that the oil and gas industry is kind of shirking off their duties and not paying taxes. And I'm going to preface this as there was a time a few years ago when there was issues with, the industry was down. So some companies weren't paying their taxes, which is a big issue all in of itself. But in general, the industry still contributes billions of dollars a year into provincial and federal taxes. I believe is an RBC report from a month or two ago. There's supposed to be $48 billion in royalties and taxes this year alone from the oil and gas industry, which is huge. And that goes to things like healthcare or whatever provinces and the federal government spend it on, roads, stuff like that.
Just to put that in perspective, that's nearly, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but wouldn't that be nearly 4% of the entire Canadian GDP?
Yeah, something like that, give or take.
Yeah.
I'm not sure the exact number, but it's still quite high. And, that's one of the things the industry gets bombarded with as well. And don't get me wrong, industry should pay its fair share in taxes, but adding another tax upon all these other taxes as well probably isn't going to help the consumer either. Because we usually see those fall down on consumers. So it's kind of that, catch-22. If they were to put on a new tax, that's just another few cents that might add up at the pumps, or could add up to the pumps.
So one is that a lot of people claim that the oil and gas industry in Canada is heavily subsidized, but actually they're paying a lot of taxes. What's another point that you think is a misunderstanding, perhaps, of people in Ontario or the East about our industry that's just not true?
Another big one is that, and I think it's starting to become more and more apparent that it's not the case, is that, and we saw this, 2 years ago, that First Nations, Indigenous groups were against development. And that, I don't think, is further from the truth. Sure, individual communities, may not like a certain thing going through, their lands, and that's totally fine. That's their lands, and they need to make a deal or not a deal that will be beneficial to them and that they can do in their own voice. But we're seeing a lot of Indigenous communities actually wanting to partner with the oil and gas industry. For example, 23 First Nations communities I believe it was last week, signed a deal with Enbridge for almost 12% stake in their pipelines in northern Alberta, which is huge. And that will hopefully bring them massive amounts of wealth to deal with a lot of the issues that you see in First Nations communities, like poverty, and especially in some communities, not even potable water. So I think that was another big glaring thing that many people probably didn't know too much about. They probably saw a lot of media swinging towards different protest groups, and groups have the right to protest, but it's just I don't think it's a general consensus among Indigenous communities that they're inherently against, partnering with oil and gas or developing resources on their lands.
So
Go ahead, Zach.
Just to clarify, just to make sure that I understand, that 12% stake, would that be in exchange for the use of their land? Is that basically what the deal is, or is there something else?
No, I believe it's just an equity stake bought into the pipelines.
Okay.
So because those lines were already there, so they're actually taking ownership of.
They're just buying. So basically, correct me if I'm wrong, Cody, but these 29, did you say, First Nation? Sorry, 20 what?
23.
Oh, sorry, 23 First Nations are buying a 12% stake in a bunch of pipelines in northern Alberta.
Yeah.
And they're not being given it. They're investing in it because they believe in natural resources.
Yeah, they're investing in it, and they have backing from the province as well. So they're really seeing the value that it could provide to their communities, and I'm hoping that there will be a good value from it. So they obviously see it. So who's to tell them not to do it, right? It's not. I don't like being told what to do. So why would anyone tell a bunch of First Nations communities to what they can and can't do? It just doesn't seem logical to me that someone would do that. So.
Do you think that the radical environmentalists who are pushing to keep all resources in the ground and to destroy our oil and gas industry, do you think they're misrepresenting First Nations positions on these things?
I think in a lot of times they have. A lot of First Nations leaders, Indigenous leaders I've talked to have mentioned the idea of, I guess, green colonialism or eco-colonialism. When certain groups, try and be a voice for Indigenous communities, straight across the board, where it's really a nation to nation relationship that a lot of these communities have with different companies or provinces or the crown. It's you can't paint them all as one. It just doesn't do justice to the uniqueness and individual cultures that different groups have. And one First Nation might not want to develop resources, and that's fine. That's their own prerogative. But two other groups maybe want to, or whatever the case may be. You can't paint Indigenous people as just one thing. There's 500 and some different communities in Canada. They're not all going to march to the same tune, right?
Yeah, I've always thought that left-wing people are actually quite racist because they paint First Nations as one monolith, when I've never met a First Nations person who doesn't have a clear identity of their specific First Nation and the people that they come from, and a love for that particular community. We had Ellis Ross on the podcast early on. I think it was last summer. You are familiar with Ellis Ross and have worked with him and spoken to him a bunch. Could you share with the listeners who may not be familiar with him kind of what he was able to do in his community?
Yeah, Ellis Ross was huge in the Haisla Nation, really advocating for the development of resources to help move those communities out of poverty. He's been instrumental in helping things such as LNG get more. I don't like the term social acceptability, but acceptability of a project that's worth doing, especially in his community. And I think he's taken that up to the provincial level as well. Now being an MLA in the BC Liberal Party, he's done wonders. He's been a very powerful voice, I think, for a lot of Indigenous peoples who may not have what's the right term? May not be able to have their voices heard. And I think there needs to be a lot more of that going on, a lot more listening, because we're really not going to get anywhere if we just, talk at each other. So I think he's done amazing work doing that and helping bridge that gap.
So I want to talk about the issue of the day, let's call it, which is energy prices are skyrocketing due to the war in Ukraine and various other things. OPEC just announced, I believe it was yesterday, that they're going to cut production by maybe 2 or 3 million barrels.
Yeah.
Why do you? Pardon me?
So yeah, some. I think it was yesterday. So
yeah. So what do you think is going to end up happening, and how do you see this as an opportunity for Canadian energy?
I think we're already seeing it happen now. I mean, just earlier today, I read that Denmark was now reopening coal plants because they don't have enough energy supplies to power Denmark, their country, through the winter. They're having to go back to these older methods of energy production. And, coal doesn't have the reputation of being the cleanest in the world, but it still has a part to play, as we're clearly seeing now. We're also seeing it in China's been massive on introducing these new coal plants over the last few years. Like, they're building, I think it's like at least one a day. I think the number might be higher. I can't remember the actual stat, but we're really seeing these countries that have, shifted off of coal shifted off of coal to reinvigorate that industry. And that's simply because they need to. You can't keep your citizens safe if you can't keep their power on, their heat on, especially in the winter. And it's looking like it might be a cold one this year. Hopefully not for our friends over in Europe. But in terms of Canadian energy, we have the capacity to help supply Europe. I think we just need more of a political will. And to the federal government, to the Liberals' credit, they have been talking about the idea of actually, expanding LNG infrastructure. Is it too late? Maybe this year, and maybe in the circumstance, especially if this war in Ukraine continues and all the geopolitical instability that's going on with Russia and Nord Stream and all those other energy infrastructure pipelines in Europe. Canada has a crucial role to play. We have a lot of natural gas. We're the fourth largest producer of natural gas in the world, maybe fifth. It might have changed in the most recent years, but we're in the top 5 at least. And why wouldn't we want to help supply the world? Canada grew up through from the 60s on as being that nation that can really, punch above its weight in international affairs. They call it middle power. But I think we have an opportunity to be a major player and a major power in helping supply the world. I don't think we should, shoot ourselves in the foot for a Purple Heart we're not going to get by limiting our ability to supply energy. But that means we have to actually, start building infrastructure out. We can't just, continue with, shipping straight to the States because they're getting natural gas from us, and they're probably turning it into LNG and selling it to the state, to Europe. Sorry. So we should take advantage of what we have. We're able to do it a lot better than a lot of other countries in the world. We're a shorter route for energy from Quebec to Europe than it is, say, getting LNG from Qatar. Even in the States, we're closer than Maryland, which is the closest one right now to Europe. So we're at a good opportunity to step up to the world. And I think we can do it in a responsible, sustainable manner as well. It doesn't just have to be a free for all, flaring and venting off oil and gas wells. We can do it in a way that is environmentally friendly, that will help our allies and will be able to truly make a difference. But that we need a bit more political will in the country to do that. And will that happen? It's hard to say. I think times are ripe, and I think it'd be smart for governments to start moving in that direction.
Let's talk about that for a second. You hear all the time about the negative of the oil and gas industry, but let's speculate for a second. Let's say we do open up and we turn the taps open and we send our oil and gas to Europe, and we send it as many places as we can. And, all of the things that you hope happen do happen. What would be the fallout of that within Canada? And what would be the fallout of that globally? Like, how would we make a difference on a global scale if we just turned on the taps?
Yeah. So first of all, energy security is huge. It would not only we wouldn't just open it up for the world, but domestically, if we ensure that we have enough production infrastructure, we can help prevent, God forbid, having a winter in, say, Saskatchewan, where there's nothing to warm you up, and Sask gets pretty damn cold. So having our own energy security and not relying too heavily on other countries to provide us with that security will go a long way with helping us solve, I think, a lot of internal domestic issues. And globally, a lot of BC LNG, just for an example, and most likely if LNG came online in Quebec, would be some of the cleanest, if not the cleanest LNG in the world. I think there was a study done not too long ago that BC LNG would be cleaner than Qatar, and that's just, we're in the right climate, the right geophysical, I guess, area that producing LNG and natural gas would actually probably help reduce lower emissions. And especially on the West Coast, China's already been looking at our LNG and natural gas. And that could, there was a study from, I think it was the UBC, fairly recent. Natural gas heating in China could reduce emissions by 60% from coal fired, or up to 60%, which is huge considering, China's the largest, polluter for emissions in the world. Like, imagine, reducing 60% of heating emissions in China. That could probably make a pretty good dent in our global emissions in terms of, trying to be more environmentally conscious.
Certainly a bigger dent than shutting off our own damn taps.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right? That's what irks me so deeply, because Canada represents 1.6% of the global carbon footprint. Mm-hmm. And so that means we're not really the problem, if we were to summarize it in plain terms. And if you instead shift the perspective from what can we do on our own soil to use less, to how can we supply places using dirty energy with clean energy, we will actually be making a greater environmental difference, not a smaller environmental difference, a far greater one. And we'll be putting money in the pockets of Canadians at the same time. And how that is not just obvious and already implemented blows my mind. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, Cody, what are the barriers to that happening?
A lot of it is, again, I would say it's more political than willingness of industry. Just from a simple terms of capitalism, why wouldn't you want to expand to the amount of customers that you could sell to? Like, just in terms of industry, I don't think it's industry that is necessarily the issue. I think it's the environment that politics of all stripes, I'm not just blaming one political party or one government, had in creating an investment environment conducive to allowing for the build out of infrastructure to build that out. As well as directly political. I mean, in Quebec, they outright banned oil and gas production and exploration, which is interesting since Quebec is possibly sitting on one of the largest, natural gas reserves in the country. And that has other implications domestically as well in terms of, Alberta and the money we send over there. But yeah, it's been more political will than industry. There was a letter in the Globe and Mail, actually from Modern Miracle Network. There was over 100 CEOs that signed, said they're ready and willing to explore the business case to open up for LNG and oil and gas. So I believe that industry really wants to do it, but they need the environment and incentive to do it, or else, like we see with so many of the companies back in 2014 when oil, hit the dust for one of the many times it has, that investment simply just fled. We have never gotten up to the amount of, investment into Canada from other sources into oil and gas than we have. We just haven't seen it in the last probably decade. Probably less, probably half a decade, to be fair.
So it's a political problem. What's the political solution?
The political solution is to advocate and to let multiple groups, not just one group. There needs to be multiple voices talking about the benefits of Canadian energy and the benefits that we can have for both Canadians and the world. And it's not just oil and gas. We need to have a full wholesome energy mix from oil and gas to solar to wind. We need to have it all, but we can't discount the benefits of one thing to the negatives of another. We got to have an overall conversation about it. And I think at the end of the day, especially with new carbon tech emerging that will reduce emissions, like there's already projects that would reduce emissions up to like 90%. Of emissions from production. Once we figure that out, I think we just need to keep promoting the hell of it, that we're the solution, and we need to be at the table. And they say politics is a down up kind of process. You're influenced by public, and I think Canada's leaders are especially now going to be a lot more receptive to the idea of Canada taking a step as a global player, with all the energy woes going on right now, especially even in Canada. I mean, we're sitting at, I think, $1.60 a liter in Calgary. I thought at $1.30 the province would riot, because it's almost BC levels. But yeah, I think we need to keep in all of the energy voices and all aspects of society, keep promoting that Canada needs to be at the table, and we can do that with our energy supplies.
Well, yeah, we have a solution, and we have a clean solution, and our clean solution is getting cleaner, and we are, as a country, advocating for policy that doesn't use it. It just blows my mind. I want to talk about the carbon tax, though, because that's another thing that irks me. So I believe I read, and you can correct, I'm sure either of you could correct me if I'm wrong, that the plan for the carbon tax going forward by 2030 would raise the price of gas per liter by another 13 cents. You're definitely more well-versed in the whole energy conversation than I am. What I want to know is where that tax money goes and how it's being implemented by our federal government to make the world cleaner. Do you know anything about that?
Some of it goes into grant and loan programs for different green energy initiatives, but a lot of it just, and I'm no expert on this, guys like the CTF probably do a lot more justice than I would, but from my own analysis, a lot of it just goes straight back into the coffers. Like there's not really too much of a budget line, except for some of those green initiatives, which is what they said it would go to, but who knows how effective that's actually been. I don't think there's ever been a cost accounting of how many emissions the carbon tax has saved. Especially the way it's implemented. It's not necessarily a true carbon tax. It's a carbon levy. It would make a lot more sense to have border adjustments if we were to continue using a carbon tax to incentivize the lowering of emissions, because that way you wouldn't get the imported emissions from other products coming into Canada. I probably explained that poorly, but it's a couple green initiatives is the best I got for you on that.
Well, there's also the carbon tax rebates, right, that they send back to people, like the low income people.
True. Yeah. There's also the carbon tax rebates that offset the cost. I know there was a little bit of an issue. I think it was last year, maybe beginning of this year, that it wasn't actually helping cover as much of the cost as they thought. And they're also adding another. It's called the Clean Fuel Standard, but it's almost like a second carbon tax as well. Essentially, it's mandating the reduction in emissions from fuel intensity for gasoline and stuff like that, which will add some more money at the pumps. Carbon taxes are tricky. Although on the flip side, it looks like we're kind of stuck with them, which allows for a little bit of innovation in some instances to produce low carbon, carbon technology to make it viable. But it's hard to say if it's actually helping out the general population, actually reducing emissions in a significant way, unless they release a report on it. It's kind of hard to say how it's actually improving.
Okay. So let's take it from this angle. So this low carbon technology that you're talking about, that's in development or new, let's throw the carbon tax aside and not involve it in the conversation for this purpose. This carbon technology, will it make fuel and energy less expensive or more expensive? And I guess what I'm asking is it more expensive to process the raw crude with this clean carbon technology, or less expensive?
It really depends on the type of tech. You see a lot of investment from the main the big players in the oil sands, called the Pathways Alliance. So they're investing heavily into it. The government's intrigued into it. Will it increase at the pumps? I don't think so. Because at the end of the day, it's what consumers are now wanting. And I'm saying consumers in general. It's what the market's essentially saying to these companies, that they want, cleaner oil and gas, low emissions. So companies are gonna do it. I don't think it'll raise anything really at the pumps, because it's more of you need to incentivize the companies to do it. Mm-hmm. And if they see the benefits, they're gonna probably just do it. They're not gonna have to, all of a sudden. It's like the carrot and a stick. You give the oil and gas companies a carrot. They're gonna do it out of, this is probably just gonna be better. We're gonna be able to get more customers, et cetera, et cetera. People are gonna think we're doing a lot better, versus slapping for example, an emissions cap, full stop. I believe it's better to let the private market give them a target, and let the private market hit their goals without being, handcuffed of how to do it. Let them figure it out themselves, but give them a guideline. That's kind of how it should be from the top-down approach, if there is a top-down approach.
Right. So here's what I'm getting at, and the reason I ask the question. I care about the environment. It's something that really matters to me. I love my country. I love the landscape of my country. I believe in green energy. I want the world to be a greener place. I am more than happy to pay extra money on the price of energy if there is like a verifiable, real data point that says, hey, it was 3 extra cents at the pump, but over the last 10 years, Canada's reduced its emissions by 10 or 50, carbon emissions by 10 or 15%.
Mm-hmm.
I'm all for that. I have absolutely no problem with that, as long as it's within balance. If we were paying, another $3 per liter and we've reduced by 1%, that's a different conversation. It has to be done effectively. But the gripe is, right, like if it were to happen that way, that would be, in my mind, like a producer cost. It's more expensive to produce this cleanly, but it's better for our environment. So we're all going to share in a little bit of cost. The carbon tax doesn't really do that. It just costs me more money when I fill up my car and then throws more money at the government for them to do whatever they want with. And I don't see any real, I haven't been presented with, and maybe I've just missed it, but I haven't been presented with a tangible result of this extra money that I'm paying. Whereas if it was from a producer standpoint and the producer says, we've reduced emissions by 15%, sorry, it's an extra 3 cents a liter, but that's good for our world. Absolutely. I'm right on board. So I'm excited and I look forward to what the industry might produce in terms of those sorts of solutions, because I do care. I want to leave the world a better place for the next generation. And I don't really think that there's anybody here who doesn't.
No.
I think there's very, very, very few people who truly don't care at all about the environment. I guess it's maybe a product of the last 2.5 years, but I have a general distrust in where that money might be going within the government is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I would say you're not the only one. Like I said, you hit the nail on the head correctly. I think most people would be delighted that, whatever, I have to pay an extra 3 cents, but, we've reduced emissions by 15, 20% or whatever that number may be. I think you're very right in saying that, but I don't think the federal government have done the actual calculations on that. And maybe that's out of design, or maybe they just don't know. I don't know. I can't speak to that, unfortunately. But I'm sure everyone in Canada would like to know that stat.
Yeah.
Well, Cody, go ahead, Zach.
So I guess my last question is, all of that in mind, what do you see for the next 10 to 20 years for the Canadian energy industry? Where do you see it realistically going? And is it going where you hope it's going, or is it looking bleak, I guess?
I wouldn't say it's looking bleak, but we have to have our voices heard. And I'm saying our voices in general, but we need to really impress upon governments that will come and go in those 10 to 20 years that we need to be at the table in the global world, in the global economy. And I think right now, we're seeing that opportunity in front of us. And I think there is more political will now that we're seeing all these unintended consequences of not having adequate supply of energy. So where I see it in the next 10 to 20 years is there's going to be more acceptability for companies to build LNG plants, say on the East Coast. There's going to be people are going to be more in favor of providing a lot of that cleaner energy to China, for example. I can see the energy industry going almost zero emissions, low carbon by 2050. I can see all that happening. but I don't want us to sacrifice, Canadians don't want to sacrifice their ways of life to see it happen. And I don't want to either, but I have full faith that the way things are going and if we take advantage of the opportunities to show the world that we're an actual, a player, and we can help and we can solve these global energy challenges. And the more we advocate for that, I think we'll be in a good spot. And if we don't, who knows? Maybe the world ends in 2050. But,
I thought you said not bleak.
No,
Cody,
not
we try to keep it to less than an hour for the listeners. So I just wanted to thank you for coming on. Can you share with the listeners where they can find your newsletter, where they can find you? Where are you on social media? Who should they follow? That sort of thing.
Yeah, so you can go on the Canadian Energy News Network website. It's just CanadianEnergyNewsNetwork.com. We're also on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, the whole thing. You can find me. It's Cody Ciona. Fairly easy to type in. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram and LinkedIn, so feel free to send me a connection on there. Yeah, it was great talking with you guys. Hopefully I answered some of your questions. I may have fumbled some of them a little bit, but that's just my own unpreparedness.
No, I thought you did great. You did great. And I'm just glad that we have people like you advocating for the industry that's so important to our province and our country. So thank you.
I appreciate it. And it's great that you guys are able to have a variety of different ideas and personalities and ways of thinking on this podcast to truly, like I mentioned at the beginning, everybody, and at least every Albertan, maybe not people in Toronto, but every Albertan and most Canadians have a million different ways of looking at things. It's beneficial to a wholesome, balanced conversation like we're trying to have energy here as well. So.
All right. Well, thank you, Cody, and I hope you have a great day.
Yeah, thank you. You as well. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for listening to The Canadian Story. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at The CAD Story. That's The CAD Story. If you enjoy this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. Let's work together to remind Canadians how great their country is.